Patrick, what we do is, because it was a
public meeting.
Well, it's a public meeting, and we had maybe about a year ago decided that it was appropriate to start meeting in public, in person. Part of that, we've been using WebEx. We're continuing to use WebEx for a good example. 2 of our commissioners couldn't be in person today, and we also post this on our website, which is, I think, super helpful for people who can't attend, or for people who might be attending that are like Jay and Molly just couldn't be present today. Well, why don't we do this? Why don't we just go ahead and start with a round of introductions with commissioners and your role on the commission. Do we want to go in person this time, and
Sure.
And our virtual friends, and is there anyone else that's going to be joining you?
Not as speaking. I think Kate Lichtenstein is
attending
as a viewer.
Okay.
She's not here yet.
Will.
I'll call.
Because we're oddly early.
Yeah, we're a little early.
We are 5 minutes.
So you could
Really
introduce
slow.
yourself very slowly.
So I can start, give as well context.
It sounds like we got it. Hi, Adam M. Ryan, Urban Planning position.
Hello, Elizabeth Garner, Artist Commissioner.
Hi, Matt Alfs, Architect Commissioner.
Hi, Jill Crary at large, Commissioner and Chair.
Michael Jenkins.
Ben Gist, Architect Commissioner.
And Jay, and then Molly.
Yep, Jay Backman, the Get Engaged Commissioner.
And Molly Spitalnik, Urban Design Commissioner. And are we doing any disclosures since it's not an action?
Yeah, go ahead and do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have worked for Thatcher on the past on TOD inventory, but I'm not on any open contracts.
Does anyone else have, do you want to?
Oh.
Or anyone else?
I for city work with Sound Transit, not currently working.
Yeah, and I have city work with Sound Transit as well over in Bellevue.
Okay.
Introductions.
Oh, great. You want me to go?
Yep.
Hi, everyone. Alberta Black. I'm a transit-oriented development strategist at Office of Planning and Community Development. Still fairly new, so I stumbled over my title, but thank you all for allowing me to join.
Thanks, Alberta.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Go?
Yeah.
So Thatcher and Bowden. I'm the Director of Community Development at Sound Transit. I believe you've met some of my colleagues in the past who presented about our TOD program back in 2022 and maybe 2021.
Yeah, I think so.
I've been with the agency since 2015. Since we do have a couple minutes before we'll go full out and get to my presentation. I think there's a lot. You guys touch these infrastructure projects all the time, and so you know how complex the infrastructure itself is. And the TOD kind of program, the work that we're doing is at the intersection of both the physical infrastructure we're building and all the other private and public investment that's going to go around it. And to be perfectly blunt, there is the policy nexus between continues to get more and more defined and broader. Around things like your health, and the determiners of your health is where you live. Your zip code is the biggest determiner of your health. We know about housing, and we know that housing is more expensive near amenities, and specifically around transportation. Great transit, it's more expensive to live near there. So when we start talking about TOD, we're not just talking about our infrastructure, though that is a huge, that might be the purview of this group. But the investments that we make at Sound Transit is going to have a direct impact on people, whether it's our property or the adjacent property or the property a half mile away, or sometimes, even further. And so, I think there's a lot of rabbit holes we could potentially dive down. I'm glad that we've identified 4 areas, which we could probably spend an entire semester, on. But that's probably neither the point. So today I'm going to kind of go over a presentation that kind of talks about a lot of these things. It's not quite organized in the way that I think you framed it, but I think I'm going to touch on all those things. And then I am a transit nerd. Grew up in a transit dependent household. And I'm also a real estate nerd and used to work in real estate development, and now work in public lands, which is like the perfect nerdy place for me to be. So I'm happy to go down whatever rabbit hole you want. And I know that when we get to, future briefings, when we actually start talking about West Seattle, and then later Ballard and specific designs, that we will be able to apply this stuff in a way that I'm sure you're going to want to engage and will be prepared to do. So with that, I'm going to try to share my screen. But before I do that, I just want to check maybe with Molly and Jay. Can you hear me adequately?
I'm hearing you well.
Yes, same. Thank you.
Perfect. I just saw that the microphone was over there. But I speak loud. So let's see.
And I should say Julia is going to join us as well from Nova Scotia. Julia Bishop.
Okay.
Is she coming online or is she coming? Oh, yeah, I saw her.
All right. And then just so I make sure I'm understanding how you want to run, do you want me to just kind of go through the presentation and then we'll dive into those buckets?
Yes.
And you'll stop me if you have any clarifying.
And typically what we do is we try to make an opportunity for any members of the public to comment. If members do show up, we monitor and we provide them with 2 minutes of public comment. So we also provide an opportunity for agency comment as well, but I think today is a little more informal, so we'll just, after your presentation, start making that work.
We'll run with it. All right. So Sound Transit, yeah, we're a transit agency. As our former board chair, Kent Keel, like to say, we're a transit agency with a side hustle and affordable housing. And so, yeah, we are a special purpose agency. We have a very clear directive. But our, people don't ride transit, generally speaking, maybe exception to me, for the purpose of riding a train or a bus somewhere. They're trying to go from one place to another, right? That is really about places. And so Sound Transit, while we are in the business of moving people from one place to another, we are ultimately in service to the people and the places in which we serve. And that's a nuance that I think is important, as it's over time, we've kind of changed and evolved as we've been able to kind of look at how do you develop infrastructure and how sometimes those blinders of scope, schedule, budget, of delivering quite honestly, mega projects can sometimes leave certain areas that maybe don't get touched as much as you would like. And so as we've continued to have lessons learned, we continue to try to apply them, and our board continues to adopt policies that kind of try to say how do we better reach these kind of policy nexus that might be just outside of our maybe direct core mission, but it's absolutely critical to the success of what we're building. Most of you are probably familiar. I just do want just from a grounding standpoint, what is transit-oriented development? When we're talking about higher densities and compact kind of land use and building forms near high capacity transit that is frequent and reliable, that takes you to places that you need and want to go. Also typically reduced dependence and orientation around automobiles, especially around the prominence of parking. They may not even have parking ideally, but it depends in context. And additionally, you don't start your trip on a train and you don't end your trip on a train. You have to get to the stations. And so, being friendly to pedestrians, cyclists, others who are rolling to the station is really important, or taking transit to stations. So communities that, transit-oriented development, we're really trying to make it easy to get to and from the station. And then lastly, that there's services that are meeting people's needs. Because one thing to be able to live in there, but you're also running, going to schools, or you're going to jobs, you're running errands, and ideally you're being able to do that either by walking or by getting on a transit ride. As a special purpose transit agency, we do have some goals for our TOD program. It's probably a good time to mention that when we build transit, we are also buying land in many cases, and so that land. It's construction staging, it's the actual facility itself. Sometimes it's you're impacting a property owner, and where maybe we can get away with just buying a little bit of the property, we're going to impact them so much that we're going to end up having to buy the whole property. And so you end up with extra property, might become what we call surplus property. And so how do we use that property is part of what the TOD program is focused on, but not exclusively. So our goals, generally speaking, is that we're going to use that land to create TOD. We're going to focus significantly on building affordable housing. There are cases where we are going to look to capture value. We can dive into that if you want to at some point, but we do have in our financial plan and obligations to both the voters and our bondholders some level of revenue capture that we need to do. That was baked into Sound Move in ST2 and into ST3. So whether that is generating revenue or reducing the transit capital project costs, there is a goal around that. Increasing ridership, certainly we want to serve people, and there's a correlation obviously between building housing or employment centers and increasing ridership. And then lastly, how are we serving our passengers? And we are trying to figure out how do we think about that more and then help figure out the tools to be able to realize that, so that there's things like grocery stores, restaurants, and cafes, and jobs, and daycares, and medical facilities that are actually near transit. I kind of already touched on this, but where are the TOD opportunities? Generally speaking, Sound Transit's controlled TOD opportunities are at stations typically. It's constructed staging land. We usually have more land at stations when we build underground stations, because you're at the portals of tunnels. That's where, if you were involved in the Northgate Link extension, we end up with property up by Northgate because that's where the tunnel end is. You end up with property at all the stations where, we have a big hole in the ground where you can bring in the concrete tunnel rings down into. So we end up with this consolidated land. Elsewhere, as you can see on this graphic, kind of the orange lands, if we're building elevated guideway as an example, you end up buying property the whole length, or if it's surface, you might end up buying length all along things, which is how we end up with like more what you might call remnant properties, less developable properties. They're kind of the unfortunate remainder parts of properties, which we will have a whole slide on about lessons learned later. But the vast majority of property in a station area, we don't own. And we do not get to make decisions for them. It's privately owned, it's publicly owned land that typically cities have much more control over. However, how we design our station and the infrastructure we're building will greatly influence both how that property might redevelop, what kind of other barriers exist to supporting existing people to get to our stations or future people to get to the stations. Things like, are we building new roads to access stations? This is especially in areas where if they were built after World War II and there's large blocks and lots of surface parking lots and low density infrastructure underground, or infrastructure that serves low densities, that is where what we're doing could potentially have huge influence on other people. We talk about our projects as agency TOD and everybody else's property as kind of community TOD. It's a very Sound Transit vernacular. In terms of agency TOD projects, there's kind of three typologies. There is kind of adjacent development. So again, we build a station and then there's land next to it. Generally speaking, doesn't usually have a whole lot of infrastructure on it. That's like transit infrastructure. We call that adjacent. But then there's kind of two other groups. Air rights development, or kind of would be mostly cantilever development over stations that are separate and independent from the station itself. And then there's integrated development, where there's actually a physical relationship between the station that we build and the building on top of it. We've got an example of one of those projects later. The air rights and integrated development in the industry is generally called joint development. If you're in the United States or North America, if you're elsewhere in the world, it's called overstation development. And that is like a whole section of what I think a lot of our work that we will be engaging in the future on, that you have especially opportunities with underground stations in expensive real estate locations. So we'll be talking about TOD. That's the broad category. Joint development's a subsection, which for us really is that interdependence or like hyper relationship. In terms of process, broad categories of our kind of phases of TOD, we've got kind of station planning, the decisions about where we're putting the station, what's the layout of the station, how does that affect redevelopment that might occur on our property or other people's property. Then we've kind of got this exploring of opportunities, which is usually during the design phase. We've been you'll hear more about kind of lessons learned. We're doing this a lot earlier than we used to do, where we're kind of looking at how do we lay out these facilities. We've got these must-have transit components. How do we lay those out, impact development opportunities, and looking at them early enough, you can actually tweak the design before it's too late or where it's going to have impacts. And then lastly, once we actually have a development opportunity, we have to manage the whole process of, okay, well, what should we do with it? How do we implement that? So we can actually have a place where people can live or work. So I said this when I was kind of opining before we actually got to 130, there is a higher displacement risk in most station areas. There's been research that has been done, both locally and nationally, that shows that both property values and rents tend to increase at a disproportionate, like a higher rate near transit. That isn't to say that there isn't displacement risk without the transit. I think there's plenty that we could say about this region in general with the underproduction of housing and dramatic inequalities that exist that have created, a significant difference between what people are earning and what people can afford in terms of rent. But I think it's important that Sound Transit recognizes that, in Seattle in particular, rates have increased more than 25% when you're looking at station areas, near our station areas, between 2012 and 2016, and it's also correlated with rents. So, we do care about displacement. Sound Transit is a special purpose government, and so we have very limited tools in this space. So our land is one of our biggest tools that we can do to kind of show up and recognize that this is a broader set of stakeholders that kind of have to deal with this issue. Everyone's responsible and no one's responsible, but we are trying to do our part, especially with our land. This is a rabbit hole I'm going to try to avoid going down, but I want to make sure you understand. When we went to the state legislature to get authorization to ask the voters for what was essentially ST3, the legislature said, yes, you can go and ask the voters for your system expansion plan to fund it. There's some strings. One of the strings was that you're going to use the vast majority of your property for affordable housing development. So what the actual specifics are is that of property that is suitable for the development of housing, at least 80% of that property needs to be first offered to these qualified entities for affordable housing. The state defined that as nonprofit developers, housing authorities, and local governments. And then it said if that property is transferred to one of those qualified entities, at least 80% of the housing units put onto that property need to be affordable to those earning no greater than 80% of area median income. It also then went on and said, you know what? To the extent that you can figure it out, navigating the federal government and other kind of rules and regs, you can discount the property to help facilitate that outcome, including no-cost transfers. It's kind of colloquially referred to as 80-80-80, which I kind of just described. We have been implementing that since the law went into effect, which was at the end of 2016. And we have since then offered at least about 96% of our properties first to those entities. Not every property has been taken by a qualified entity, but the vast majority have. And all the units created then under 80% AMI, and the vast majority of those are really, all of them are tax credit projects for the most part, with the exception of some homeownership project that we're partnering with the city on. And so there really means that they're mostly 30% AMI or area median income to 60% area median income. Broadly speaking, again, these are Sound Transit specific properties, not other people's properties. We have about 3,100 housing units that are in various stages of development. That's either built, under construction, awarded to our development partners, or that we're currently negotiating with like a live development partner. 2,300 of those units are income restricted affordable housing. It is a giant investment. Our property alone is not enough to make an affordable housing project happen. A property is worth typically about 10% of a project's costs, and so we are contributing our land most of the time at steep discounts and for no cost. But we are partnering heavily, and our developers are partnering heavily with other entities to help make these projects happen, which we'll talk briefly about later. Our portfolio is actually getting big enough now where I can't actually talk about all the projects anymore without taking up too much time. So, we are covering the regions. We've been expanding under our ST2 program. We are finding that we are now working in jurisdictions where we weren't working before. Our first project actually was in Federal Way when we built the Federal Way Transit Center. But for the most part, most of the projects have been in the city of Seattle because that's where the initial segment was built. We are today seeing more projects in the pipeline that are in places like Bellevue and Redmond and Kent. We've got some projects coming up in Federal Way and in Linwood. And right now we have one project that's under construction in the city of Seattle at the U District, which is a joint development we'll talk about later. And we've got a whole lot in the pipeline that is really exciting. But what we are finding, and we'll talk about, is just how as we have, these ballot initiatives are big vision projects, multiple mega projects being delivered all in succession. And what it has meant is that we are bringing so much property, like these stations are opening in quick succession, and they all got property. And that just means that no one wants to sit with a vacant lot next to their station. We still have some vacant lots from the initial segment, and we got a lot of critique about Capitol Hill, where it's at, I think, vacant for a year and a half before they actually started construction. No one wants that. We get that, but it is a scale issue, and it's not just a scale issue for us. It's like the whole industry, cities, the infrastructure. There's a big focus on affordable housing, so we can talk about just like how oversubscribed those systems are, and that when we start talking about how do we realize all these things, the inevitable discussion is going to come up of how do you sequence these when you can't necessarily do everything at one time. So that's just something to be aware of. So I'm going to talk a little bit about planning and design transit, which I think is probably more your purview and more interest. But I'm going to talk about that next. Then we'll talk about kind of the TOD projects themselves. How do we plan those? And then lastly, I'm going to talk about lessons learned, which we're going to cover all of it. So some of the stuff you've seen before, or some of you may have seen before, kind of talking about scale. When we are planning transit, there's a variety of scales that are going on. One is around the station itself, the investments Sound Transit and our jurisdictional partners are going to make to realize that transit. That's kind of a 1 to 3 blocks around the station. Things like the utilities that are going to have to be changed and modified and put underground and all that kind of fun stuff. What streets we're going to put in, the bus facilities that are going to have to go in, all the modifications that come with building a station. How we do that will influence immediate blocks the most, but potentially has cascading impacts beyond that, right? In terms of how it might influence development. Building a new sidewalk or building a new street cut through in a spot that didn't have it before might make a property a few blocks away only like a 3-minute walk to the station, when right now they might have to walk all the way around a super block. So trying to define our footprint, one of the things we learned, which I don't have a slide on later particularly, but is that what was happening under ST2 projects was that we were doing these kind of preliminary, station conceptual plans, 5%, 10% design, and it was really focused on the stations. And what was happening is that we weren't doing a lot of big stakeholder workshops, and so you weren't necessarily getting all the people thinking at the time about kind of like the big picture. What's beyond the station? What's going to happen in this neighborhood? What's the long-term plans for the neighborhood? Which then meant that by the time that those conversations happened, we were at 30% design. We might have just finished up preliminary engineering, we're going in final design, and then communities and jurisdictions were like, we've had more time to think about this, we actually want to make tweaks to that, which then impacts scope, schedule, budget of the transit project. So one of the things that we started implementing on ST, kind of towards the tail end of ST2 projects, we're starting to bring these stakeholder and community workshops at 5-10% design much earlier, so that we can daylight those issues and take it into account when we could actually probably make tweaks without major impacts. So when we talk about focusing on the correct scale, we're talking about both the kind of immediate footprints of what we're doing, that's kind of important for us to move along, but we're also trying to spark that conversation about what is the bigger vision in play, because if we need to move a station a block, Like, we needed to talk about that before we get through the environmental impact statement process, not later. And to the extent that we can get agreement as to what we're working towards sooner, the more likely we can all realize the goals that we're wanting to achieve. Part of, I don't know if we've really done this yet on some of these projects, but we did this on like downtown Redmond Link Extension. That's the example that's up here. Is that we kind of created a station context framework. The idea was we did these workshops. We wanted to document kind of how are people going to get to the stations. What are the bike routes that people are going to use? What are the pedestrian routes? Where are the buses going? But not necessarily just through the blinders of the transit project where we have, passenger pickup and drop off, paratransit, we've got the major bus lanes, but also just trying to get the city to think about like bigger picture. And so we how do we land some of those workshops was through kind of a station context framework document, trying to flag things that again might not necessarily be only a sound transit responsibility. I'll get a kind factor perspective here. I think one of the things that we've seen a big change, and it was something that was in ST3, baked into ST3, was that when I got here at Sound Transit, some of you met Sloan Dawson, we both came here in 2015, right when ST3 was being worked on. One of the things that we saw was that there was a lot of distrust of collaboration between jurisdictions because Sound Transit is essentially an infrastructure developer. And we ultimately have to get permits and be zoned by local jurisdictions, which is not necessarily how other places do it. And that comes with pros and cons. And one of the things that we saw was that it created this kind of distrust. If you bring up something that is outside our direct scope of work, it's going to become a permit requirement. And so that meant that some of those things like, you engage the community, they don't care what is a Sound Transit responsibility versus what is the city of Seattle's responsibility versus, King County Metro's responsibility. They're just like, I want to go from my house to, University of Washington to go to school. Like that's what they care about. And they're like, crossing that street that's 3 blocks away is a really hard thing. And so the station context frameworks it's kind of a way to kind of daylight some of that stuff and start the discussion of how do you deal with these things that may, Sound Transit may not say, it's not a direct impact from us, but it's important to our mutual constituents. So that's kind of what some of the planning work needs to be able to do to be successful. But it needs to be done in a way that everyone can trust and feel like it's not going to lead to requirements. So that's that perspective. But it's something that I think that was baked into SG3 was trying to figure out collaboration in a much more intentional, meaningful way that isn't so reactionary. In terms of planning for development, we do evaluate layouts of stations for future development. It's not just, okay, you've got this property that these assumed properties we're gonna acquire, and how do you shove everything into that box? We know that happens sometimes, especially it's very frequently happens in infrastructure development, regardless of whether it's Sound Transit or others. So trying to look early enough at what do you actually need to do to be successful for future development at the time that you're laying out the potential streets or investments, critical, including things like if there's going to be redevelopment afterwards, how is that going to be serviced by trash, with utilities? How are people, if there is parking, how are they accessing it? If there's residents or office tenants, how are they going to load if they move in and move out? If you surround a building 4 sides with transit infrastructure or protected bike lanes and transit streets and a passenger pickup drop-off zone, and none of those things can be interrupted, then you might actually have a problem with realizing a development project. You have to talk about that early enough during the design process to work through it. We do want to avoid undevelopable remnants, and that's kind of getting at this issue of if it's just kind of like this property works and this is how we're laying out everything, and at the end of the process you're like, oh, yeah, we got some surplus property, look at that. Is it developable? Then like we failed. But there are times, like we can't buy for TOD, like that is not a statutory thing we can do. And so there are circumstances where we do end up with those remnants. We try to avoid it now as much as we can, and I think, Rainier Valley is an instance of where there was a variety of things that took place where we didn't see our role in it. We were the T in TOD. We saw that, we were widening a street that runs perpendicular at a diagonal across a grid. And we had to put in streets and sidewalks and all sorts of improvements that widen the street. And if you can only acquire what you're impacting, you end up with these properties that were small. Like, ideally, that won't happen in the future, but I think some of it is like circumstance, and some of it was also perspective of how we were doing things. But we'll talk more about that. And then lastly, there is more than just physical layout that affects development. The underlying legal structures of property is something that we've been finding where if you don't clear things from title, people have rights sometimes to property that don't get cleared with infrastructure projects that can tangle a project up for years. Whether that's usually it's some sort of like restriction on title from like, oh, you can't build housing on it. We're dealing with a property right now where we bought property, had a previous property owner had agreed that they would never build housing on a property. Well, now there's no office market and probably not hospitality. And like, what do you do with this piece of property that you fundamentally have a restriction on, you can't build housing on, but you probably could build housing on but for that. Trying to navigate that is a difficult issue. There's pathways, but it's hard. Zoning, every city has zoning issues. I'll just be honest, every city has something that the developer has to work through. So that you can always do work there. And then lastly, like engaging communities, we've been trying to have these conversations much earlier so that we can start to understand what are people trying to work towards, so that we can take that into account while we're planning. Major factors, so on the joint development spectrum of those kind of integrated buildings that I mentioned, there's a whole lot of planning that has to go into that. Realizing a development on top of a station is not something that happens by accident. It happens with incredible intentionality. And there's some major things to work through that limit its ability to be realized. How we design our structure, in particular, important. Things like vent shaft placement. How is the vent going to be vented onto the street? If the idea is that the vent is going to keep running up a building that later gets built, that's not actually going to happen. And so venting to the street at a lower level is probably an important thing to do. Because you get into constructability issues of having a live infrastructure piece underground. That's just an example. How we deliver it also matters. So to the extent that they can be sequentially delivered, build the station and build joint development after, that is probably the most flexible, the most likelihood that you can get it. But it's not always possible. There might be some cases where you will not be able to come back later. So you need to figure out how do you actually deliver that station. There are some international examples of having developers deliver shells as an example for, say, exits that come out from underground stations. Again, that's not the core transit facility, like the huge station, but it is a piece of a station because you might not have the ability to do it later. And so that's not to say that we're hoping that that's the minimum situation of trying to figure out how to realize, to align the timing of a transit project with the development. But it is something that's important. The upfront investment requirements. So, an example is if the station has to, carry the weight, some of the weight of the actual building above it, that's going to cost us money. And so we're going to have to engage our board in conversations about what is the, cost benefit analysis of how much you invest on the front end, whether it's utilities or modifications to the station design, whether it's engineering or design. If that has a cost, what's the benefit on the back end? And that is something that we're going to have to be able to both quantify and then be able to discuss and have some sort of decision-making framework around. Additionally, prioritization of public benefits, I think it's especially acute here in this region, where we want our projects to achieve as many policy objectives as possible. We want to push and make sure that we are getting the most for in interest of the public, but we can only saddle projects with so much ask, especially depending on what kind of resource we are going to bring to do that. And so I'm just flagging that these are the kinds of things that are actually really, they're fun policy discussions, but they are like a thing that you have to solve, which is if it's going to cost an extra $5 to $10 million to, I'm just making up numbers here, to build a station that can support a development on top of it, and you're then saying, oh, by the way, we want to have 100% affordable housing project with as deep AMIs as possible. We're going to bring all this public money. The question is, who's paying that $5 to $10 million extra, and how do you reconcile that at a policy level? Not to say that we shouldn't do it. It's just that's a real policy question for the policymakers. Local infrastructure resources, these projects, whether it's us or a developer, they're often, in this state where the local jurisdictions are extremely financially constrained by the Constitution and other factors. We've been, I guess, I don't want to call it fortunate, but a lot of jurisdictions have been fortunate that the real estate market has been incredibly strong, and the developers can upgrade the infrastructure and can afford to upgrade the infrastructure, whether it's sewer lines or sidewalks and all that kind of stuff. And so, as we do development, whether it's joint development or not, trying to figure out who's actually paying for it and when does it get built, and that is especially acute if we're talking about affordable housing, because they just only have so much money subsidy to go around, and they can't build all the infrastructure. And some of our projects, more outside of Seattle, that's a huge issue. And then lastly, TOD supportive zoning, bigger issue outside of the city of Seattle, things like parking. But there's all sorts of things that come up in that space, whether it's FAR or building setbacks and step backs and all that kind of fun stuff. I just want to pause for a second because I think it's important to note on zoning, in particular around joint development. The graphics are from the U District station. So when we were designing that station, we didn't know exactly what the zoning was going to be. We knew that the existing zoning was not likely to be what it was going to be, but the city hadn't gone through the process, and we didn't know how to guess. But we needed to make a decision about how much weight that building was. How much weight does the station need to carry? And so, we didn't have. Long story short, we'll talk about that one later. We didn't actually own the air rights to that building. The University of Washington owned it, and so they had their own process to figure out who were they going to bring on as a developer. And so it was the University of Washington as a property owner having to make decisions about how much money were they going to help invest to realize the outcome. They made a guess that it was about 11 stories of office that was going to be the height, and that's what they agreed to help offset some of the cost of upgrading that station to support the development. Turned out the height was going to be a lot more than that. So the actual zone height is significantly higher. I think they get 320 feet. But they can't realize it because the station can't carry that weight. So as we start talking about, when we get to the stuff that you're going to be engaging on, there are going to be stations that the city might be contemplating other zoning changes, but we're going to have to make decisions about joint development before we have a joint developer on board, because we are talking about a project that's 10 years away. So that's just something to be aware of. Is we're going to have to talk about assumptions. And just to give you an example, we did a huge effort on Capitol Hill, engagement for years and years and years with the community. And some, folks at the time, some people were like a little uncomfortable with the level of density that got built there, which is about 7 to 8 stories. And then after the building opened, there's some stakeholders who were like, why aren't there towers? Sound transit failed, kind of stuff. And so I think we're talking about long horizons in these projects, and how do you have those conversations about what the community wants? And at the end of the day, we have to make decisions, and those decisions are being made years in advance of when the actual station opens, and people, I guess, get the benefit from transit and think about their communities maybe a little bit differently than maybe they did during the planning phase. Maybe seeing totally different stakeholders. So that's a fun thing. So I'm going to keep moving. Planning and implementing TOD projects themselves. So great, we have a TOD site, but what are we going to do with it? These are not formal terms. These are just kind of phases of we explore what can we do, right? Get to touch and feel and engage people about is it affordable housing? Is it 6-story, 7-story? What are people really want daycare? We want large family-sized units because we have great schools, all that kind of fun stuff. Then loosely pre-development, kind of before the building starts construction, but it's really, that's the process of us partnering with people. What are we doing? What are we going to achieve? Who's going to help us do it? This is when we go out and find a development partner. We have to give them a certain amount of flexibility because they have to go out and permit the project with the local jurisdiction. They got to go find the money and align all the financing of it. So that during that phase, we have to kind of navigate how hard can we push people to get exactly what we explored and engage with the community, but we also have to reconcile that we aren't the final say in what gets built, because I'm not paying for it. Affordable housing, I do have skin in the game, so to speak, with the land value, but I've got a whole bunch of public funders. We got federal government that's involved in affordable housing. So in the state government, I got to give people flexibility. Then lastly, we've got construction, which if it's adjacent to our sites, it's usually pretty limited coordination, you know, it's making sure they're not gonna, I don't know, their crane's not gonna tip over onto our property, you know, their trucks aren't gonna run us over. But when it's on a joint development project, like U District Station, if you've been getting off legally there, like there's a whole lot of construction coordination and inspections and making sure that that joint development project cannot, under any circumstance, impact the ability of providing transit or jeopardize the safety of our employees or our riders, like, or the public. Like that is unbelievable amounts of coordination. And then lastly, we get to benefit from it, right? People are gonna move in and then everyone will forget about it, about how much pain and suffering it was to get there through the public process. But it'll be great and we value them. I'm not gonna talk about all the steps here. I think the main line here is we do some scenario modeling, which is based off of site constraints, right? So we kind of we do some work around what is the property, what are the constraints? Is there loading restriction, soil loading restrictions on the building, you know, because it's next to an underground station? Is there going to be limitations of the loading docks? All that kind of stuff we put as an input into kind of modeling some outcomes. We do community engagement, we do financial viability modeling, we engage folks, developers, community, funders, city, to kind of make sure, are we modeling the right things? Trying to land people on some goals for the property and an actual strategy about how would we actually realize those goals? Is there an actual way to do it? With the idea being that we are going to end that process with what we call an offering strategy. Again, I'm not going to go into all the details, or a development strategy, where we are trying to say, what is the property that's being offered? You know, how are we navigating the 80-80-80? Is it apply or not? What are the goals for the property? Are we going to lease the property or sell the property? That has a huge impact on everything. How are we pricing the property? And then we go out and we have to develop our solicitation documents. Like we have to go and partner. We have to go find people. And we got to tell them a whole lot of stuff about the property. And it's important. The reason I'm standing on this is because these processes aren't for the faint of heart. And the more complicated we make them, the less people want to partner with you. Because they can just literally buy the property across the street and not deal with us. So there's a constant navigation of trying to be, how hard can I push? And how much did I not damage our ability to realize the outcomes that people want? And then lastly, you know, kind of we get into, ideally, we're going through that process and we're finding a development partner, and they're going to tell us what they're building, kind of generally speaking, what they're going to do, how they're going to realize it, how we're going to structure this deal, and then we like move on, right? And then they take over. We partner with others. Like we know that our projects won't generally happen without obviously a developer. Community-based organizations are playing an increasing role in our projects. For affordable housing in particular, we partner with local governments. We've got an incredible relationship with the Seattle Office of Housing, King County, Arch, which is on the east side, where we will pair our property. We'll say, hey, we're bringing our property to the table. We will discount that property. And why don't you bring some pre-committed local resource, join us and award that site with affordable housing money to a developer who can then just go off the races and not necessarily have as much risk that their project's not going to move forward. So we've been doing that and fairly successfully, and we continue to learn lessons that we're going to apply. Secondly, over the last number of years, you know, these projects are not being built. Almost every affordable housing project is basically being built with low-income housing tax credits, which is a federal program that the states administer. And there's these private activity bonds. Without getting into the weeds, there's this oversubscribed state bonds that have to get issued, and they are so oversubscribed that they are just stopping really good projects across, you know, the state from moving forward. Period. End of story. And so we do all this work to align local resources. The voters approve more money, right? They approve the housing levy. We bring more and more local resources, and then we get stopped because the system doesn't have. There's a different blockade in the system. Public land for affordable housing was a blockade at the time that ST3 was written. Is not really the blockade that exists today. So we partner with the Washington State Housing Finance Commission to create kind of a separate process. They're now coming into our process on the front end with the local funders, saying this is a local funder priority project. It's got land, it's got money, local money. It's not going to have to wait in line in the same way that other projects have to wait in line, because we've already said that these are important projects. So we've been doing that. And then lastly, we partnered with Amazon Housing Equity Fund that brought some grant dollars and low and some flexible debt to our projects. It's been extremely useful to get a pre-development grants for our developers so that they can design projects before they actually close and actually have money. And additionally, in some, depending on the location, their money has been as good as public money. And so in places like, we just broke ground yesterday at Angle Lake Station, and there wasn't a lot of local public funding available for that site. And but for Amazon's dollars, we probably wouldn't have had that project move forward at all, let alone it grew from being an 80 or 95 unit building to a 130 unit building, in part because this resource was there. So it's a very important partnership. Project examples, I'm not going to dive deep, just I've got two that I really want to focus on, and I'm running out of time, I know. Capitol Hill, there is many of you who actually probably know way more about Capitol Hill than I do, so I just want to flag that the process for this has gone on for decades, and that we've now realized all the development on the primary parcels. There's still one parcel left. It's a 4-building project, 428 units. This was done before 80/80/80 in terms of its rules, so we had no ability to discount land. There's a 110 unit affordable housing building built by Community Roots Housing, which is the one in blue, and then Girding Eveland, which is no longer Girding Eveland, out of Portland, developed the rest of them as market rate housing with MFT units. And there's retail, there's a plaza. This is a project that I've got kind of two images here. One that kind of shows the underground infrastructure on the top, and the bottom one's more of like a site, like a very conceptual site plan. Technically, these buildings, for the most part, are not built over the station. It's not a joint development in that way, but there is incredible amounts of physical relationship in terms of, the pedestrian tunnel, if you go out the west entrance, does actually cut underneath the site C, but they were able to cantilever over it, so it was kind of like, it's a coordination issue, but it's not physically carrying the weight. And most of the site is actually, that the station, above the station is actually a plaza, because it was concluded that they didn't, that it was not worth investing to figure that out. I wasn't around for those decisions, so I don't necessarily know all the ins and outs, but this was a big project really around the community process, and I think for what it's worth, maybe just the bow I'll put on it is, there was a lot of distrust that Sound Transit was going to do, quote unquote, the right thing, and so we had an incredible level of community engagement that took place to get Sound Transit at the table. And there was a large design process with the city. There's a development agreement. There's an urban design framework. There was an extremely prescriptive design that took place. Basically, tell developers this is what you're building, and there's not a lot of flexibility to it. It's been described by some of the people on the Capitol Hill champions that were the kind of representatives of the community in the process, that it was a necessary evil. And I think in general, we've not replicated that level of process since our projects, in part because it takes so much effort that you can't work on anything else. And we've successfully implemented projects that I think the community has been really happy with less process. In particular, Cedar Crossing, smaller scale project, but our first project under 80/80/80, it's at Roosevelt Station. It's technically an adjacent project in the sense that it's not physically built on top of our infrastructure. But it is built, there are restrictions on what they could build because of the underground station next to it. It's an all affordable housing project, 254 units. And the community really wanted family-sized units and some deeper levels of affordability they basically said, we've got great schools, we're near the Green Lake, all that. We want to have families be able to have access. And so they supported a significant amount of affordable housing, pushed us to do as much as we can, and include lots of family-sized units, because more than a third of the units are family-sized. In terms of design, right, station issues, we did actually look about building over the station, and I think it was a good lesson learned for us in terms of sensitivity analysis about how many things could change. You do a static analysis that says, look, if you build on top of the station, you're going to get this many floors and this many units. What's the cost of allowing for that? And the conclusion was we weren't going to ever make back that money. The board chose not to do that, but we did. There was a lot of intentionality of making sure that TUD was going to happen, and so one of the lessons learned was really around construction sequencing and making sure that the contractor demobilizes, gets off the staging property early enough. So when they're done with the big heavy civil, building all the building, they got off the property so we could turn it over to a developer who could start construction before the station opened. That was pretty cool. But that took a lot of intentionality in the weeds at Sound Transit to make happen. I'm not going to get into all the other stuff. I do want to talk about this one. Getting back to the station context frameworks, or just thinking about what is it that we're trying to achieve. There was a desire after our project was already the TOD project was well into the permitting process that SDOT and the public utilities were like, we actually want to think differently about the north block, the 67th north side of the property, which is where the community was like, we'd rather have you put some of your loading and parking and stuff, because 66th Street is a green street that connects to the high school. And Roosevelt is a pedestrian in a retail street, and the station's on the east side. So you have to put loading and trash and parking somewhere. And so the city said, oh, but we're doing this rapid ride project. We're gonna put electrical lines on that street. You need to move everything to the other side of the building. That was like not the time to have that conversation. So we got through it. Everyone like leaned in and said, how do we work through this problem? Everything worked out. But the point was that like there was inevitably evolution in thinking, but asking that too late in the process could actually cost a year in design and cost $1 million or less, maybe less, of redesign for an affordable housing project. It just was like not ideal. Again, we worked through it, but that's the kinds of things we want to avoid. Our first true joint development, integrated joint development, is at the U District. It's under construction now. You can go take the train up there, walk around, and get a good feel for it as we speak. I mentioned earlier, University of Washington owns the area. That is probably not something that we need to get into today. The point is, there is a transit building that we own, and there's everything that's kind of the private development that's occurring above that we do not own. University of Washington owns. Their partner, they've leased it to Lincoln Property Company, who's building an office building, but then UW will lease from them. Talk about not believe. So that building, that the station was designed to carry the weight. There's an actual TOD transfer beam there. There's a bunch of stuff that was done to allow that building to get built on top of it, including like during the design process, like they actually had to open up the station roof to connect in to that station. So like there was a lot of design coordination. There's a lot of intentionality of the station's design. That's why when it opened up and everyone was like, why is the head house over here? And there's a head house over here. And then just like a big empty lot in between. That was because we were waiting for them to start construction. Now I can talk about, we've done lots of affordable housing purchases to the First Hill property. We bought a property for a station that we didn't build, so we didn't gave it for affordable housing. It just opened earlier this year, which was really exciting. And then our most recent opening was Pride Place, which was a project that is focused on LGBTQ plus senior affirming housing. And it's an amazing project on a property that we didn't actually like buy for a transit purpose, but we swapped with Seattle Central College. So I think the takeaway, the reason why I shared this one is that sometimes you end up with properties that are hairy, particularly we had this property in Capitol Hill that was that didn't have any way to service it next to the west entrance, that west head house. It was an L-shaped property, and it has no alley, and there's no street frontage but Broadway right next to the streetcar spot, and it was very narrow. And so the question was like, how are you going to build a building there and not have the trash and loading happening right next to your station entrance and next to this, streetcar that if it ever were extended, you would have a huge conflict. And so Seattle Central College swapped properties so they could consolidate their site onto property that they owned, so they can build a new entrance to their school eventually. And we would facilitate affordable housing on a property that they own because we can discount for affordable housing. So it was actually a major win. I think it gets to the power of partnership and collaboration. When you have a problem, there is always a way to solve it. We will put in the work to figure that out. Lessons learned. I mentioned we thought we were the TOD. It was a very limiting framework to say we're not the right party. And so that meant that in some cases we leased property for construction staging, which when you're building an underground station, the cost benefit of leasing property is not there. You end up paying to relocate the people off the property. You pay them rental money for so many years that you could have just bought the property and had the same value. So I think the idea at the time was we're not the party to facilitate development let them, those property owners, deal with it. Well, Beacon Hill, as you probably remember, there was property sitting there vacant for, what, 12, 13 years before anything really happened. And it had to do with, who owns it. We still have property at Mount Baker. When you get off the station, you walk through that plaza on the right side. We do not own it. It's fenced off. Everyone thinks we own it, but we lease the property. So, so sometimes it works out. In other cases, like people redevelop, and not always. Property assemblage. This is a pet issue of mine, which is we are only one public property owner. And I think this is especially true in Seattle that we should be thinking about, which is we will buy land. We do have sometimes unfortunate situations where we have a non-developable property. This is Mount Baker, a block south, where the guideway crosses over into the public right-of-way of MLK. And you can't really build on our property because it's really underneath the guideway for the most part. It's bifurcated by a city alley that's unimproved, right? It's not really being used by anybody. King County Wastewater owns some of the block, and part of that block they have a future project on, and then private owners own the rest of the block. Our property, which is, I'm willing to say it's an eyesore, not contributing to the community, it's a fenced off gravel lot, isn't the play to figure out how to get that property to be contributing to the community again. We need all the partners to come to the table. And I think what, I'll say that, how these public agencies, and I would encourage, in particular, alley vacations, how you approach that and say, look, we're all property owners here and we're all going to have to approach it, as opposed to a reactionary process, which is we go and assemble something and then we go and ask for permission to see if the city's interested in vacating an alley for something. Like, that is not a recipe for success. The recipe for success is getting everyone to the table. I'm not picking on this site. I'm just trying to flag that as we go forward, we will want to look at adjacencies and what does the city or other public agencies own, where we could all lean in and say, what are we trying to achieve here? And then map out a process to realize it. Otherwise, we get these kind of situations that we've been trying to figure out. Community and jurisdictional engagement can take time. I think, you move at the speed of trust, as the saying goes. We definitely try to be transparent about our processes and trying to figure out how to focus people on where we think impact is. Well, happy to engage on all topics, but we think that there are some areas where we should definitely spend more time because the ability to influence it is different. This region in particular is highly successful at innovation and systems reform compared to, say, other regions. And I think that's important because, we all can sometimes be pragmatists, and pragmatism in this region is probably less important than other regions. So I do think we try to provide space where we can give people flexibility to realize stuff, see if they can go out and reform a system. But that is harder when you're talking about critical systems of like integrated joint development and decision timelines. Like, that's something that's going to have to be contemplated, is how much space do you allow for systems reform if you have critical deadlines that if you miss them, you've lost the opportunity. So I'm not sure exactly how that's going to all play out, but the time is, and decision making is a critical thing with transit infrastructure, and figuring out how much reform, what sites are the most conducive to systems reform is important. What I mean by systems reform, because maybe I should just say something to that. Money, projects need money to be built, and sometimes there isn't a source, and so sometimes you have to give people space to go and see if maybe the legislature will give them a special money, or they can go out and hustle and find money. Like that's one area. The other would be federal rules and regs, or other kinds of rules and regs. Can you go and get change? We were successful. If we want to eliminate federal funding in property, which is usually a big constraint, there wasn't a way for us to do that and say transfer property at no cost to a community-based organization or a nonprofit developer. We had to transfer it through a local government. Local governments in this region are not as, there's not a system in place to be intermediaries, which meant that governments have to figure out how to be an intermediary. It was actually easier to go get the federal laws changed. Believe it or not, we were successful. Congressman Adam Smith, without getting into the details, went and changed the federal laws so that we can now transfer property to nonprofit developers or community-based organizations for affordable housing and eliminate the federal interest. That was a game changer, but extremely wonky and just slid into the National Defense Act of 2021. So I'm systems reform is possible. You just got to be clever about how you do it and how much time you can do it. Time and resource, I think it's self-explanatory. we all have time. We only have so much effort. We're going to be building a whole lot. We're going to have to pick and choose where we're going to focus. And you know, there is a natural tension, and I'm saying this not because I like the tension, but it exists. Do you want to create more housing sooner versus creating projects that might tick off as many policy buckets as you can, which might require that systems reform and may take more staff time. Those are, you know, we are always shooting to try to achieve as many policy outcomes as possible, but there is a natural tension that I think we need to talk about more in this region. Prioritizing goals, providing development partners with flexibility. The gist of it is, we have learned that if you do not prioritize your goals, even if you bucket your goals into what we've typically been doing more recently, which is like our required must-haves, our high priorities, your project should-haves, and then the nice-to-haves. That's still probably not enough because those buckets end up being pretty big. And so developers are guessing, right, as to what we really care about. And that means that people are spending time and money that they could be spending on other things, chasing our deals and then feeling frustrated at the end. So we continue to try to apply those lessons about how do we, to give you an example, Capitol Hill, the developer who is the second ranked developer, spent $250,000 of actual cash, not staff time, actual cash chasing that deal and was not happy about it afterwards. And you know, I think $250,000, that's a lot more than say $30,000 or $40,000 chasing a deal of cash and then all the staff time. And so I think we've been looking at, you know, if we're asking developers to spec the kind of railing they're installing and the kind of green roof they're putting in, like that is too much detail. So we've tried to reduce the burden of what we're trying to do. Avoiding the remnant properties. We talked a little bit about this. I think, you know, I call it the exit strategy, but basically getting people to not think of it as a happy accident if we have leftover property, and instead thinking of it as integral to the transit planning project of saying what is being left and how is it going to be treated. It is unbelievably true that transit projects like to normally, you know, if we're not buying the entire block, we then have to make sure that our investments aren't going to impact the neighbors, depending on where you are. It might be a noise wall if it's a single family house that's next door. But those projects change over time, right? Someone buys that property, they want to redevelop it, and they're coming to us and having us redesign. And we were like, oh, well, that was just going to be a landscaping strip that was a buffer. Well, it could have been something different. And I think this might be my last slide. Yes, perfect. So I'll just say the issue of acquiring land next to remnant properties, not always will we be able to avoid remnants, but we shouldn't have to necessarily be the only people showing up to buy property, and trying to figure out how to broaden the tools available to other governments is an important thing. So that was my presentation. Sorry if I went a couple minutes long. We should have time to talk.
Well, thank you. That's a lot, and I'm still digesting, and I imagine most of us. But given that this is about how we're going to go forward as a commission to help cut across all of these things, to just advocate for excellent stations and excellent areas around the station and TOD around the stations, I want to give Alberta a minute or two to tell us, because I know you're new in a newly created post, but I see you as we see you as a big partner as we go forward. So, because what we're wrestling with is how do we take this information and move forward, and we want to move forward with you. So, can you spend a couple of minutes about how you see going forward?
Thank you, Jill. I want to acknowledge my colleagues also here, Andrew and Julia, and so I will start, and then I will leave them. They really are such better experts. So, yeah, my role was created, I think, in a few budget cycles ago, but I came on in July. And I'll just say briefly, my background was in affordable housing. The opportunity to bid on the station RFP and Beacon. And so I have a certain amount of understanding of how these processes work. And then what I'm working on now is understanding from the city perspective and our equitable development goals, and an FTA grant that received in 2020 called Equitable Communities. The number of facets, including government parcels, are very exciting. Thinking through how can we work through these various facets of equitable transit-oriented development, both in policy and having systems and structures and resource opportunities, and also building out our relationship with Sound Transit so that we can really be partnering and collaborating earlier in these processes to yield better results for communities, especially the communities that we are prioritizing, which is communities at high risk of displacement. I won't go through all the different kind of categories we would assign to that, but that's all documented in the equitable TOD documents we have on the OPCD website. So I'll point you all to those documents, which these two were played a major role in offering, but I want to turn it over to about the strategy.
I think we see our role in this FTA grant as kind of bridging both like what is happening with the build out of Sound Transit 3 investments and also our accountability to the communities at high risk of displacement and the things that kind of the multiple co-benefits, community benefits that they've been asking for as I'm not going to use the word mitigation because I think that's a technical word, right, that is used in the planning and the build out of the light rail station. But, you know, as we have come back time and time again to disrupt the activities and created policy that has caused harm in these neighborhoods, like how are we maximizing community benefits associated with the public investments that we're making, the public investments that Sound Transit is making. So I think we see ourselves in this process as a bridge between our constituents in these neighborhoods and then the infrastructure investment. But I think also, you know, in the Sound Transit context, in the TOD policy, like part of it is what's happening at the station, but I think most of it is actually what's happening outside of the station footprint, kind of in that station context framework, but even outside of that station context framework. And so how are, you know, like what are, it's both policy, it is about land ownership, and like where there is interaction and connection with the land that Sound Transit has, we want to be able to facilitate that, but it's also like what are the resources that we're bringing to the table as a city. We have you know, 5 years now of the Equitable Development Initiative under our belt, where we funded community owned real estate and development projects. How do we leverage our expertise and the community's expertise in delivering those projects? So, anything else to add?
Yeah, I'll also add that a lot of our work is about bridging, but it's also working with the communities that are most impacted to set the priorities and then also to identify where is it where we can, we will leverage the investments, but where is it that there's still gaps in meeting community priorities, and that's the process that we have.
Great, thank you. We also have John from the Planning Commission staff. Do you want to say anything?
Not at this point, we're just here mostly to hear what the Sound Transit approach to TOD is. We'll engage in the future.
Great. Thank you for coming. Valerie, anything you want to put in before we, is there anybody online we need to?
They're most, they're Julie Montgomery and Kate Lichtenstone.
And they were just going to listen.
Yeah, and yeah.
Okay, so we've heard joint development defined as probably the highest level of coordination we would love to see going forward, but also the hardest to put together in the time frames that are available. Any commissioners want to ask any specific questions about or or discuss joint development? I see Molly has her hand up.
Yeah, so I have a high level question about that. So I know, Thatcher, you mentioned the comparison of the more housing sooner versus meeting more policy goals, and you also talked about 80-80-80 rule and the goals for affordable housing. And so can you talk a little bit about when we look at joint development, have you started to engage with developers about what they're afraid of or willing to do around joint development? And have you engaged with affordable housing developers to to really determine, are there any possibilities for air rights development or integrated development for affordable housing developers? Can you just talk about some of that? Any early conversations that have happened about the potential for those with affordable housing developers?
I mean, so on joint development specifically, we've been engaging with ULI and kind of their different local product councils. There's a TOD one, there's a multifamily housing one, and there's an affordable housing one. We will be doing more engagement in 2024 on this topic. So we recently received a Build America Bureau to USDOT group grant to advance what we're calling a regional infrastructure accelerator for joint development. It's a $1.75 million grant. We're using that grant to kind of do two things. One is that it's for West Seattle and Ballard, and it will be used to take joint development designs to about 30%. This is something that we've seen as a best, seeing as a best practice from some other regions, Toronto in particular, where they're saying, well, to make informed station design decisions, you need to know enough about what the joint development is going to look like and the trade-offs that might have to exist, whether it's design or kind of structural. So we're advancing that in 2024. We've started that work already at Alaska Junction. I'm not supposed to get into West Seattle, so I'll try not to. Also, part of that grant is also doing some developer engagement. So we are going to be partnering with the Urban Land Institute around doing some workshops with the development community, which will include affordable housing developers as well, to look at kind of what are some of these issues that we're going to have to navigate, especially around joint development, and really it's to inform station design decisions. I would just lastly say that we are also kind of starting to think about the strategy and what, we're going to do some engagement more broadly around what is our overall approach to a portfolio of joint development and TOD projects that we will have. I think there's some working assumptions that we need to test with our stakeholders, including the city, around, we think we're actually going to have a fair amount of TOD and joint development opportunities across West Seattle and Ballard, and that as a part of that, the adjacent sites I talked about that don't have the infrastructure on them, those are probably, since they're at the stations, like they're right there, they're probably more desirable by the affordable housing developers because they don't have the same level of cost and risk, as well as likely retail requirements from the city, which retail in affordable housing is very difficult. So we think that so long as the opportunities are vast, it's possible that we will end up, again, I'm getting ahead of myself, but I will do that. I think that there's an assumption that a certain amount of those adjacent sites are going to be probably the focus and priority should be on affordable housing with those, because they're great sites and are easier to develop with less risk for everyone involved. And that those joint developments that are integrated are probably the ones to focus on to the extent that we are pursuing value capture. Those would be the locations. Maybe there's inclusionary zoning and MFTE units and other kinds of things that you can get affordable housing. But we haven't done enough work in that space and done the engagement necessary to land what I would call a corridor strategy. And so I'm sharing that in the context of, yes, we will do developer engagement. We have some big decisions that are going to be coming up in the next couple of years around the project to be built, and station design decisions. And so we're trying to capture the developer feedback that affordable housing developers might give you one set of feedback, and for-profits that are building market rate housing might have a different set of feedback based off of things like how important is parking, or how much money can they actually afford, like to take on risks on certain things, or how they view retail.
But before we get to the adjacent piece, on the joint development, it's great that you've got a grant coming. I think one of our big concerns is, how does the evaluation for looking at joint development potential factor into the preliminary engineering in a way that we can be included in discussing opportunities before they're foreclosed. I think the foreclosure of opportunity is one of our, as you're gonna hear, is one of our sort of concerns.
So I think so that one of the things we did differently on ST3 projects than we did previously was that during the essentially alternatives analysis, where could we put the stations, we actually did a cursory TOD and joint development analysis. So every single station alternative basically looked at, can we build on top of it, can we build next to it, and understand some of those tug wars that exist. So that way when we actually got where we are today, we know kind of what for some of these individual alternatives, what are some of the big issues we may have to deal with to your point about foreclosing opportunities. If we can't solve this, then it's going to go away. As we continue to move forward, now that we're in, I guess what we're calling phase 3, or now they're moving in to preliminary engineering, looking at how are we advancing the station designs? That's one reason why we are trying to advance and try and time that work on 30% joint development design so that we don't foreclose on it. So we can have, ideally on most of the stations, that's the output, right? The architects and engineers can look at, and developer input can come in and say, here are some of those things you might have to change with the station to be able to not foreclose on that opportunity. So it's happening now. It's happening now at, say, the junction, and it is going to be happening in 2024 for a vast majority of the other sites, so that we basically don't foreclose.
And Thatcher, I would add on to that and just say, so getting this briefing from you at this moment in time is super helpful for us to walk in informed as we're providing feedback. So I would just ask that you stay connected with Design Commission staff so that as early as we're able to hear what are some of the outcomes of that 30% and those ULI developer conversations, the better you can keep us informed about what you have learned, the better we can respond throughout the process. So I'll just put a plug for that.
Go ahead, Ann.
I had some kind of related questions, and maybe you covered this, but you mentioned the station context frameworks and had kind of a nice clean graphic for that. Is that a document that's produced? I guess when is it produced and who is it shared with is my first question. And I've got a follow-up on that.
Broadly speaking, we were doing them in conjunction and collaboration with local jurisdictions and stakeholders. I think we can follow up about specifics on West Yale and Ballard and how it showed up there. But I think one of the things that the example I used was from Redmond, downtown Redmond Link Extension. And that was a set of stakeholder workshops that included groups like King County Parks and City of Redmond and I can't remember all. There was like a variety of different, like WashDOT and a variety, mostly public agencies, but I don't believe exclusively public agencies. To kind of talk about what are all these issues, and there's downtown Redmond Link Station, and there was the Marymore Village one. And Marymore, just to give that as a context, was a station that has trails, and it's got a major park facility, and it's got new highway stuff that we had to change. And so those documents were outputs from the workshop. So in some of the in the ST3 projects, we're doing them earlier, and so it's more of an evolution of process steps. So we've done a lot of engagement with communities themselves, in addition to kind of interjurisdictional partners, where we look and try to start detangling things. And there are a variety of graphics that got produced that are in our environmental documents and other.
It looks like
Sure.
Kate has her hand up.
Oh, perfect. Kate can talk to us.
Yeah. Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention specifically for West Seattle Ballard, and I think this came up at the meeting we presented at last month. Anyway, I hope we can provide a link. I think I made sure Valerie had the link, but there are specifically we call it a station planning progress report. It's a really nice document. It's on our website. It's available to the public. We have one from January 2022. It really nicely captures all of the work that we had done up to that point on looking at opportunities, access, TOD, all of the things that Thatcher was just talking through, the locations of the stations and opportunities surrounding the stations as well. So I do hope you have a chance to look at that report. It is really comprehensive and has a lot of this information. And it was the basis of our presentations over the last couple of years around stations and station context planning.
Great, thank you. And just the follow-up question on that was, it seemed like that kind of graphic and that level of planning then was driving some of your, what I think you described as joint development feasibility modeling. Is that right? Kind of what's feasible on these sites? And so my question is, are you able and have you shared some of that feasibility modeling with some of your partners early on? You were talking about systems reform, which I think is really interesting and really important. And I was wondering if that information of what's feasible where is making it to some of those agency or jurisdictional partners.
Yeah, I don't know, Kate, if you can speak to the specifics on West Seattle Ballard. I think in broad terms, we have been. I don't think we're at the point where we're ready to have conversations about what kind of, say, zoning reform needs to occur to allow for it. I think we were trying to, at the point, we had a lot of station alternatives. So what we were trying to understand was more about what are we intending to acquire for that project based off of, say, construction staging needs and the physical permanent facilities, and are we going to be left with property that could be developed? And so I don't think the intent was necessarily to start having the conversations around systems reform. It was more around trying to inform some discussions about how individual alternatives of where you site the station could support development more broadly.
So because you raised that issue at a previous meeting, we did have an opportunity to talk to Katie Heyman, who's now OPCD lead.
But she was on, she just.
Oh, was she? Of course.
I don't recall on her.
She's just started in the position, but we did talk, I think, at some length about the work that OPCD has and is able to do relative to the station, independent of adjacent or offsite development sites. I think that the first example might be a little closer for her to talk about. The second one, I think, less so. Because there's a zoning and land use, a package of those changes that are eventually going to have to make their way through policy.
And so, given that we've got 15 minutes left, I rather than go through these separate categories we laid out, Valerie, I think we should just open it up to just any question or discussion that commissioners want to have. Molly, did you have more?
I'll hold and let others ask. That was the top one.
Jay?
Yeah, I had a comment / question. I know that, a lot of this development conversation does have a hub around the stations, but particularly for any of the alternatives that Sound Transit pursues that has on-street or grade level light rail alignments, I want to make sure that we're considering what limitations and opportunities that can provide for development in the future as well. As you might end up with lots that you don't want to hold on to in the long term, but you need for construction. Ultimately, those lots will have one side that's completely abutted against light rail and may not have some connection to other networks within city streets. So as much as I think the station focus definitely is that prominent role for TOD, I also want to make sure that we're staying mindful of some of those alignment discussions. As you brought up that one situation down in South Seattle where the overhead line actually kind of cut a parcel, limiting its development opportunities. So that's the only comment that I really had there.
Okay, thank you. Adam, any other questions?
I was interested in the two examples you gave of educational institutions being partners in development.
Okay.
And I'm just wondering if that's something that could be explored further. You talked about bringing other development entities into the mix, because Sound Transit isn't will be expanding. Is that something that you're actually looking for, or is it just accidental?
I think in those cases, it was more about the context of how we showed up to that land. Seattle Central College, we had tunnel easements with, which created conversations that maybe otherwise wouldn't have happened. And then the University of Washington also owned the property before we came along, and so that got us the conversation. I think more broadly, we are looking at how do we do cross-sector partnerships. We have done that pretty successfully with affordable housing kind of funders. We are trying to plug in a couple other areas that are intentional. Primarily, it's been thinking about healthcare, given the nexus between where you live. There's a lot of policy reasons why you want to talk about healthcare. Education is important. We have a project across from Highline College in Kent, and so we are engaged to some degree, but we have not specifically thus far reached out to educational institutions within, say, do you have interest? Hey, we're going to be building the station here. What's your long-term plans? And have you been thinking about what kind of facilities or investments you might make into, say, neighborhoods? That's a good suggestion. That's something we can think about. I think the other is libraries. Something that we've been flagging is other kind of public institutions that are important to people, and access is important. So we have not had those conversations yet, but I would like to have those.
Great. Matt?
No, I don't have any questions. Thank you.
And so, Ben?
I guess I live on MLK, and so very familiar with your leftover triangles. And thank you for the explanation, because I've always wondered. I've lived there since 2006. I'm like, when are these going to be developed? Some of them look like they're developable, like for townhouses or maybe a couple single family. It looks like they could be developed. Just kind of curious, is there any plan? They just have a chain link fence around it right now, and just wondering if there's. I'm assuming there's other ones, not just in my neighborhood, but I'm wondering what the long-term plan is for those.
So briefly, we had a lot. Right after the initial segment opened, some of those were not developable, that now are developable, thanks to the zoning code changes around like minimum lot area, and I think just generally speaking, the industry has very much accepted very small floorplate townhouses. Right. We partnered with the Seattle Office of Housing to the City of Seattle on a homeownership initiative. So we transferred a few years ago 10 different sites that were probably some of the more developable sites along MLK, where we got that money to, we got the federal interest in the property extinguished. We were able to transfer the property at no cost to the city. The city committed affordable housing dollars to the city. Home ownership and is a very specific kind of product and expertise and skill set. We really said the city can manage that process. They've been going out and successfully been awarding sites in batches to different developers. So none of them have started construction yet. So some of those sites might be actually sites that are queued up and they're in various stages of kind of design. At least the larger ones. There's a few that we would say were small and not easily developable that we've been trying to combine with adjacent properties, some successfully, some unsuccessfully. We won at Dawson's. Anyway, we've got one property that's under contract with an adjacent property owner that we combined 2,000 square feet. Yeah. And we've got others that literally are 8 feet wide that are not developable, and we'll sit there until we can figure out, between SDOT, us, and the adjacent property owner, somehow we have to figure out how to do something with those properties. And so far, it just hasn't been a good nexus for, say, stormwater improvements or bicycle facilities. We've explored them, but we continue to try to figure out how to.
The only thing I'd say about that, and I was looking for the letter back, I think in 2019, the commission actually wrote a letter on the issue that said, we're very aware that there's remnant parcels that probably aren't developable, but they may be interim or temporary uses that the community could embrace. Pea patches, things like that. So I can find that letter if that's helpful.
I reviewed it before the meeting. I think.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah, and I will say that it's very interim uses is actually one of. We figured out how to do a lot of reform and figure out how to transfer property to other groups. it is extremely difficult to do interim uses. The federal rules are much more limited, and it's much more complicated, I think, politically to get those rules changed. So I think, it would be easier for us, and we can't discount for anything but affordable housing.
No,
And so I get my point, it's like, there are lots of things that from a policy perspective, we'd be like, absolutely, yes, let's figure that out. And you run into dead end after dead end after dead end. P-patches is an example of something that, but for the city paying us fair market value as a lease for a crappy property, like we wouldn't be able to do it.
Got it.
I don't like being that person, but I'm just like, it's hard.
That's helpful content. Sorry.
Right, but you'd think that there still might be some way, if the property transferred to someone else, you could do an.
To a third party, a recognized CDC or some other agency that had the credibility and the legal authority to do interim or temporary uses. Assuming that was available.
We are more than happy to engage with somebody who could do it. We can't.
Sure.
And I think, that has been something we've been trying to figure out how to navigate. I mean, I can't even get, we should be able to figure this out, but we have not been able to get like a food truck to even be able to park on our property and service the public. Like that takes an enormous amount of staff time to try to get done. We are still trying to figure out how to get it done.
Sure.
But it's just, that is a rabbit hole that we could go down. I think we all agree that as a public policy output is awful. It needs to be addressed. We just have not successfully navigated that issue. And some of our peer agencies have done better in that space, but it usually requires partnering with another government agency and figuring out how to exchange money. And that is the problem. It is a real problem.
So can we talk a little bit more about community development then? Because that's what we
Okay,
hear.
we have Julian. I just have a question about the discount, like, in a question about, an 8-foot wide parcel and in a discount. How do you determine the fair market value of something that is not developable? And like, just thinking about the calculation as somebody who is involved in real estate projects, that like the highest and best use, like what is the highest and best use of that parcel? And it would seem like it would need to be discounted from, a per square foot value of something that is developable, because I think there might be questions like we might be like the Seattle Beach Patch program might be willing to acquire something, that wasn't $60 per square foot, but maybe it's $20 per square foot or something like that. And what does discount mean in a situation like that?
So as a federally funded agency, we have to follow federal rules on it. So we would have to give basically the appraisers piece of like information. They're gonna, so it's really up to the appraiser to determine it. That's the problem. And then and so I think we've had, without getting into too much of the weeds, the question of who would be a natural buyer or like that, we've had weird circumstances with appraisers where they would say, who's the motivated party? And so the appraisers typically would take what they would call over the fence value, because they're saying, well, somebody would have to buy like a property that's not developable, no one's buying. And so who would be buying it? Well, a city or a public agency would be buying it, and they would be paying the over the fence value to buy like the adjacent property. We don't necessarily agree with it.
Of course.
But that's how the rationale where you can look at a property and say, this is useless property. And they're like, no one buys useless properties. So therefore, you can't have a no value property. And so that's where you get kind of hung up, where you can't get appraisers to agree. And you're like, that's crazy talk. And that's how you don't end up, that's how you get stuck.
Right, you can get appraisal instructions.
And I can't manipulate the appraisal assumptions. So.
Got it.
So again, yeah, I think you can figure, that's worth a deep dive.
Especially deep dives.
But backing up, this is all part of that, what you hear from people when you go out and talk, especially at the level at which you've been out in the community with, sometimes at 3, is community-oriented development. And so what does that really mean, and what are the concrete steps to pursue that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've been trying to figure out, with engagement with communities, what are the goals that we're trying to achieve, and then reconciling kind of how much property do we have to be able to achieve those goals, and how much can any one project do it. So at Capitol Hill, we had a lot of property to work with, And so things like finding the farmer's market a permanent home,
Mhm.
and having a plaza that served the community, figuring out retail, that you had enough, there was enough space to be able to figure out a strategy, I think. So it's kind of project dependent. We've done exercises like on the home ownership initiative. We went and engaged community-based organizations, and we did an exercise kind of around, are you trying to maximize the number of housing units you can produce? But there's only so much money and so much land, and so your question was, do you have fewer larger bedroom units versus more smaller bedroom units? And by engaging communities with a tool that made it really simple, we were able to, and then have people talk about why they said that what they did. We actually heard a lot about like whether or not individual communities were trying to address, say, senior housing, and where like some people have really intergenerational families and then more bedrooms. So like it actually was a very useful way. So I don't know, we probably don't have time to get way into it. I just think generally we try to do engagement and then match shit up with what we got and the levers we can pull on.
And just a couple of last pitches then. You brought up libraries and school.
Educational institutions.
You know, the childcare initiative you had with El Centro in Roosevelt would be very important as something to look at other places. And working with the arts office on their art space program. Because I know we had a gallery at Mount Baker until it became viable retail, and then that's gone. So how do we keep those kinds of spaces around as well?
And I might just pitch to something the city is doing, which is, they have a partnership around Grow America around an affordable commercial space, specifically trying to bring BIPOC business owners back to communities that were displaced. And so we just had a recent conversation with them. It's a major program the city is sponsoring, and just those are the kinds of issues that we're also interested in, and trying to figure out how can we partner with some of the efforts that, whether it's the city of Seattle or the state, daycares has really been something that the state has really tried to help align resources to have affordable daycares at affordable housing locations, and that's something that really we're benefiting from because of the work that other agencies are doing in that space in the community, the community organizations that are delivering these projects. So yes, we are interested. We're trying to figure out how we can partner as much as we can to leverage these, I think Bob from the Washington State Housing Finance Commission listed waterfront properties that Sound Transit has are incredible opportunities to deliver on all these public benefits. So we need people to engage probably years in advance so we can find the money and make the political will possible.
Great. Well, thank you. Valerie, we good?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alberta.
It was
Thanks, everybody.
very
Nice to meet you.
informative.
Bye, guys. Oh, if I never turn my camera on. Can't wait.
Isn't that convenient?
It's-